Russia is not only our enemy, they are one of our most significant adversaries and probably the most dangerous. And treating them in any other way is naive and essentially will come back to bite us big time. We need to maintain the policy that every president, left, right, and center, Democrat, Republican, has had for as long as I can remember. Uh, that Russia's not to be trusted, and we are the leader of the free world, which means we actually have to lead it and be a part of it.
We have eyes on.
Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Eyes On. Full crew here today: Mick Mulroy, Jason Lyons, Andy Milburn, and me. Wild week. Big change in our foreign policy, I guess. I guess we think now that that Ukraine started the war, which was news to me. Ongoing peace negotiations, or what I mean, if you can call them that, glorified peace negotiations. You guys, yeah, we haven't had a show. We didn't talk about like the meeting between the U.S. and Russia in Saudi Arabia without Ukraine or EU input. A lot cooking. Let's just kick it off. I mean, you guys are on top of it. Mick, you go first. What do you got? What are you thinking?
Sure, and I'm sure there's a lot more to follow on this, but I guess we could start with, everybody's entitled to their own opinion about their own facts, right? So, Putin's a brutal dictator. He would probably tell you that. And he started the war largely because he would like to see the reconstitution of the Soviet Union, right? Not because of the expansion of NATO. We saw NATO expand because he invaded Ukraine with Finland and Sweden. And he said basically he didn't care. So let's start there. If you back up a little bit, though, if you look at I think it's called the Budapest Agreement or Memorandum back in the mid 90s, when Ukraine, the fall of the Soviet Union, the US, the UK, and of course Russia guaranteed Ukraine security if they would relinquish their nuclear weapons back to Russia. Um, it wasn't legally binding, but it was an agreement by the United States. So it's important to point out that this goes way back. They've been asking to be in NATO ever since then, and we have not allowed them. Um, so where are we now? We're at a position right now where the U.S. wants to enter into a ceasefire agreement. I think that is a good thing. I think General Kellogg, Special Envoy Kellogg's plan is, as he put it out there, fair, freezing the conflict, um, not requiring Ukraine to concede terrain, bringing in NATO forces or European forces, and the UK and France have already proposed, I think it's around 30,000 coming in into heavily populated areas, which is very good for Ukraine. And then freezing the conflict so the Ukrainians can essentially rebuild and rearm and refit and get ready if Russia again violates their own agreement. And that's something we should keep in mind when it comes to actually how this agreement would go. The pressure, I think the fair points of criticism on the Biden administration are that we essentially slow rolled major weapons approvals almost as if we weren't really wanting them to win. I don't think they would say that, but just not lose, right? And I think a fair criticism would be you could have done this all in one swoop, that if you invade, we're going to prove everything that they requires them to win, and then not have this debate publicly and just drag it out. The other thing, and I think it's a fair point, is Europe has been providing their security assistance as a loan, right? So not just providing it complete like we have. So the idea that there should be some kind of agreement that does deal with these rare earth elements, which according to the CSIS or CSIS study is trillions, like 10 trillion of dollars potentially. It's going to cost a lot of money to extract from the ground and use. But perhaps going forward, the U.S., not for what we already provided, going forward could come up with some kind of agreement to defray the cost or the basically invest in Ukraine. And if I was advising President Zelensky, I would say, well, if you gave the U.S. some rights to the rare earth minerals that are currently under where Russia is occupying Ukraine, you're going to get the biggest country on earth that now has a vested interest in getting them off, right? So off that terrain. So I think that's a fair point for the Trump administration to try to be balanced at this. But to your point, D, last point, Russia is not only our enemy, they are one of our most significant adversaries and probably the most dangerous. And treating them in any other way is naive and essentially will come back to bite us big time. We need to maintain the policy that every president, left, right, and center, Democrat, Republican, has had for as long as I can remember. That Russia's not to be trusted, and we are the leader of the free world, which means we actually have to lead it and be a part of it.
Andy?
Yeah, well said. Andy, what are you thinking? I know.
Yeah, I mean, rather than simply echo Mick's words, which I think were right on target, I would just add a couple of things, and so take my full support for what Mick just said. And let's look at the peace agreement itself, right? So the problem with this is only Russia and Ukraine can maintain that peace. You can't put a European peacekeeping force in there and expect them to keep the peace, all right? Certainly not enforce the peace, but not. They are going to be helpless in the face of violations of the ceasefire, and I'll explain why. You're talking about the two most powerful militaries in Europe, both of which now have 3 years of modern war experience facing each other across over 1,000 kilometers of front. And you're talking about tens of thousands of relatively inexperienced European troops in the middle there. They don't know the terrain. They don't know the rules. They haven't experienced anything like what both Russian and Ukrainian soldiers have experienced in the last 2 to 3 years. If either side decides that they're going to violate this agreement, and it doesn't even have to be a conscious decision, whether it's at small unit level all the way up to corps commander, there is absolutely nothing that a paltry force like the one that is suggested can be put in there. The Russians alone have been losing 30,000 people, 30,000 dead a month, okay, at the height of the war. 30,000 dead. The entire German army is 68,000. That's 2 months worth of casualties at that rate, okay? The entire German army would be. I'm just using that as an example to show how pitifully inadequate the peacekeeping force is going to be, all right? So again, we're having to trust the Russians. All right, and the Ukrainians, yes, of course, but I share Mick's concern. I don't for a moment think you can trust the Russians to keep the peace. So there has to be some other kind of sanction. There has to be, we talked about, hey, if the Russians violate the ceasefire, then it's all on, right? It's all on. NATO. It opens the floodgates on weapons, opens the floodgates on letting Ukraine, a pathway for Ukraine to join NATO. You have to stipulate that, because you can't rely on a peacekeeping force literally to enforce the peace here. The peace is only going to come from Putin. It's only going to come when he is so afraid of the consequences of violating that ceasefire that he will adhere to it. And anyone who doesn't realize that is hopelessly naive.
Good point.
That is all on that topic. But I will say one other thing. I'll ask you a question for the open audience, unrelated. How many federal workers at the average federal worker wage would you have to fire to make up for one aircraft carrier? 160 million. I did the math. 160 million. All right. That's how many.
Touche.
Okay,
Good
so
point.
that's my whole point.
Yeah.
That's my whole point. We're going after the wrong things here if we want to cut the budget. But I digress. Go ahead, Dean.
No, very well said. I mean, isn't there like 2 million federal workers, like total workforce? You know what I mean? Like, a little short there in terms of cutting head, cutting scalps basically. One thing that came out today, Zelensky was at a press conference and he made a statement saying that he would happily step down because of the talk about him being a dictator and all this stuff, because Ukraine is under martial law because of the war. That he would happily step down if Ukraine could join NATO. And I think, what are your guys' thoughts on that? Because that's a big talking point about from the right about Zelensky being a dictator and hasn't been elected in a while.
I mean, I think it's an altruistic statement, and of course, it's one that put up or shut up. It's great to say it. It's heroic and noble to say it. But are you really going to do it? But I believe that, not knowing the man myself, just what I've seen, I believe that he would do it if it meant peace and that his country could not just have a short-term peace, but a long-term peace as well. So I think that he would do it. I just don't know that there's enough support on the right, that he would do it, and then something else would come up. It would be something else that he's done wrong. And then too, and I'm ignorant on this, so I'm asking the question, who would be a good candidate to take his place? I have no idea. Like, I don't know anything about his cabinet or anything like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a red herring because it's only the United States and Russia that have accused him of being a dictator. I mean, Zelensky's criticized within his own country, but he's not criticized for being a dictator. He is criticized for a few things. And by the way, I'll preface this by saying I admire Zelensky. I think he is has been, regardless of whatever his flaws prior to the war, he has shown himself to be an extraordinary war leader. And he has had the gravitas, the charisma, and the courage to be almost iconic and represent in again, almost Churchillian way, Ukrainian determination to defeat Russia. So good on him, and no easy task when you think what he's had to deal with. But I don't, who's going to, how is this going to hasten a peace agreement? I mean, I don't, I think the Russians may put something in there about Zelensky leaving. I don't see why the United States would. And, again, within Ukraine, when he has been criticized, it's for lack of preparation for the war, for kind of, and this is largely from the army, has criticized him for not listening to their concerns that the Russians were indeed going to invade, which led to a lot of tactical through operational errors, such as failing to really fortify Mariupol, you name it, and so resulted in unnecessary casualties at the beginning of war. That's the criticism of him prior to the war. The criticisms of him focused on the fact that he hadn't done what he said he was going to do against corruption. But as a war leader, he's fired plenty of people when he's had to. He's shown significant courage and has really, as soon as something pops up and is brought to his attention about corruption, he's made it public, which takes a lot of courage in a nation at war, and has fired those responsible, to include, I believe, in two cases, the head of his intelligence, the head of the Ukrainian intelligence, in one case for corruption, and the other for suspected, according to Zelensky, complicity with the Russians. So, he's shown leadership. And to your point, Jason, I can't, I'm not very au fait with Ukrainian politics now, but I can't think of anyone who's going to step into his shoes at this point.
So Churchillian is a good way to, I think, describe President Zelensky, right? Yeah, sure, he has his flaws, just like Churchill did, but he also stepped into, his time in history, the finest hour in Churchill's sense. When he said, "I don't need a ride, I need more ammunition." At the time he said that, most people thought he was done, right? That this wouldn't last 3 weeks, let alone 3 years, which I think tomorrow is the 3-year anniversary, right? So he is under the Constitution. They don't hold elections during a time when they've been invaded by a foreign country. So it's not him not holding elections. If he were to step down, and I do think that would be a noble, altruistic view, just like Jay. I guess somebody would just have to step into his shoes. That was a part of his cabinet, right? Because they're not going to hold elections. I mean, how do you hold elections when 20% of your country's occupied, and any given minute you're going to get incoming, right? So I think it's a red herring. I think Andy's right about that. I don't know why there's so much angst against Zelensky. Potentially, it's the whole issues with investigating the Bidens or what have you. But it's not about, I think, his leadership in this time of conflict with Russia. I think everybody will view that as what it is, Churchillian, and he's the one they elected. And by the way, his polling is not 4%. I think it's more like 57%.
Yeah.
Everybody Googled it as soon as that was said. So it's higher than, most. But I think we need to focus on the strategic implications here, which is ceasefire. Yes, good thing. General Kellogg, Special Envoy Kellogg's plan deserves a lot of attention, and hopefully we can get it to a point where both sides agree, so we can start this ceasefire.
Hey guys, it's Jack. I just want to talk to you for a moment about how you can support the show if you've been watching it, enjoying it, but you'd like to get a little bit more involved and help us continue to do this. You can check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/theteamhouse. And for $5 a month, you can get access to all of these episodes of The Team House ad-free. The same goes with our affiliated podcast, Eyes On, with Andy Milburn, Jason Lyons, Mick Mulroy. That one, you will also get all of those episodes ad-free. And you support the channel and the show, and we really appreciate it. The Patreon members are literally what has helped this company, this small business survive, especially during our early years. And you are what continues to help this thing going, even as we navigate the turbulent world of YouTube advertising. So we really appreciate all of you guys. There's going to be a link down in the description to that Patreon page. And there is also going to be a link to our new merch shop. So if you guys want to go and get some Team House merchandise, we got stickers and we also have patches. And I should mention, if you sign up for Patreon at $10 a month, we will mail you this patch as well. So we really appreciate that. But they're also for sale on the merch shop. And additionally, they got t-shirts up there, water bottles, a tote bag, coffee mugs, all that good stuff. So please go and check them out and support the show. We really appreciate it, guys. Thank you.
Yeah, the only viable alternate as a leader I can think of might be Valery Zaluzhny, right? The former chief of the army, who was very popular within the army and in Ukrainian society, and well regarded by foreign leaders too. So I mean, that's. But I haven't seen him, and there was talk of him actually as being a post-war leader, but I haven't. I don't think he's entered into this discussion.
I want to debunk a little bit more of that disinformation. I mean, Mick hit it on the head a little bit with the 4%. It's actually 57 in terms of Zelensky's approval. The narrative that 350 billion.
Any U.S. president would be quite happy with that.
Yeah. Oh yeah, forget it. Yeah.
No matter what point of his term he was in.
Yeah, and the other big one, that big narrative, was that we gave them $350 billion. Half of it's missing. I mean, you guys know more. I mean, it's obviously not true. It's not close to that, really. It's, just you get
about 170 billion total.
I mean, a dollar transactional approach to this just loses the whole point. The point is this. That NATO is the strongest that it has probably been. No, not probably, the strongest that the more united than it has been since the end of the Second World War. We've got Sweden and Finland joining. Both countries said they would never do that. You've got Poland stepping up as a leader on the eastern flank. I mean, 4% of its GDP on defense, and the Russian army has been atrophied beyond imagination over the last 3 years. The Russians have been absolutely shellacked. Now, on the other hand, they have developed extraordinary capability in the areas such as, I mean, they tested capability now, let alone not just drones, but everything from glide bombs through to EW. So, although their army's been destroyed, they've had a chance to test a lot of other their systems that are proving quite formidable. But the point is that Russians have been brought to their knees by this war. The economy's not doing well. The army, we talked about the casualties they've been taking, and at the cost of what? Not a single NATO soldier, not one. All right. Now that may seem quite cold-blooded. The Ukrainians have certainly suffered, but my point is, and when we talk about dollar cost, that is nothing. How much did we spend on Afghanistan plus all the blood, right? Plus, thousands of Afghanistan and Iraq, thousands of British troops, but you didn't hear people belly aching about that. No one complained about the money, and now it's a big issue. But the point is that all these things have been achieved without losing a single NATO soldier. That's quite something.
And they're largely weapon systems made in the United States, right? And every dime that we spend, it depletes Russia. I mean, I heard somebody say today it's about the Ukrainians have killed about 4 times as many Russians as been killed in Ukraine. Their military is being decimated. I mean, completely decimated.
I read something that said
our strength is relative to them.
I don't know how true it is, but I read something that said that Russia's lost about 1% of their male population, entire male population in this war. It's crazy.
And that, in the war itself, and then who knows what percentage have escaped overseas. I know the figures are out there on Google, but millions of Russian males of military age. You just have to visit Dubai or Yerevan or many other countries to see what has happened there. So I mean I just don't get this fixation on how much money we have spent. Even if you don't care about our values, all right, even if you think the United States doesn't stand for any values, it goes back to Mick's point that Russia is our adversary, and we've seen our adversary being bled dry over the last 3 years, with very little cost to us.
Yeah, and another bit that was swirling around yesterday was during the negotiations, I guess, for the mineral deal. It was floated that they would cut off Starlink internet access to Ukraine if they didn't sign the deal. And it's like, I'm going to editorialize, guys, so trigger warning. I don't know how the fuck you use that as a bargaining chip during a war to sign some mineral deal that'll pay us back 5x, like it's some deal where there's a body count. People are fucking dying every day. And like to use that as a bargaining chip or a tactic is just kind of fucking disgusting. Gonna be honest.
It's extortion.
I mean,
be recognized by everybody that wants to use Starlink in the future.
Yeah. I mean, Musk already limited the full capabilities of Starlink, right? Less than a year into the war. I mean, there's no doubt about it. Of course, the Ukrainians use it and are quite dependent on it for their communication systems. But yeah, I mean, all of this just seems quite dystopian to me. It really does.
Yeah. So, I mean, hopefully it works out. I mean, where it benefits the Ukrainians. Like, I don't want to see Ukraine get stripped, completely fucking stripped. And it's for past support. It's not even for like the next year or two of more support from the US. It's just like what we've done for them in the last few years. Yeah, I don't know how you're Zelensky and you signed that deal, especially when you have Europe stepping up too. Like Europe spent more money and given more support than the US by, couple 10 billion. Um, so it's not like they're totally alone without the US. Obviously, that's a huge help. US, firepower and stuff, and intelligence support too, because I could see that being the next thing that goes. Um, so I don't know. I don't know how they signed that deal. I really don't.
I think it has to be for future support, right? I mean, that's just normal contractual type agreements. It's too bad we're to a point where we're not actually the leader of the free world. This is basically just us looking out for financial interests in the United States. I understand why that could be a component of it, but now that's become the entirety of it. It's just like we're trying to make money. This was our partner. We collectively, the U.S. government, and if we don't honor past agreements, then essentially why would anybody enter an agreement with the United States in the future ever, right? So we agreed. We didn't do it, and we supported them to our own interest. And now we're at a point where we are actually, instead of being the big brother of Ukraine and pushing Russia, we don't even have any idea whether Russia will agree to any of this stuff. We haven't asked them anything yet. They might get to the table and say, "Yeah, we're not interested in any of these plans that you've bullied Ukraine into taking." That's a very real possibility.
I'm hearing that they
Russia
pushed back.
not.
I'm hearing that they pushed back on the European troops being acting as the peacekeeping force. That I don't know how true that is, but I'd heard that was already a big sticking point with them.
Yeah, that's the good
Yeah,
point. And it was in our plan.
Say again,
Putin wants
Andy.
the North Korean. No, I was joking. Said Putin wants the North Korean peacekeeping force.
Yeah.
I mean, it gets back to the fact, you need to put in an incentive for Russia to adhere, and by that I mean a massive disincentive, which is, we're all in on providing Ukraine with weapons, and NATO membership, by the way, and honestly, think what a asset Ukraine would be to NATO membership. You've got the most powerful, the most experienced army in Europe, and pulling it into NATO's fold would that would be an unbeatable team. Got Ukraine and Poland side by side. There's going to be no more infringement on NATO or threats to infringe on NATO territory. The Estonians are all in too. I mean, yes, they have small militaries, but they've got high-end capability. And by the way, the Estonians are organizing, have been over the last year, kind of a European coalition's the wrong word, but it's like kind of an industrial manufacturing agreement to mass produce 155 rounds to keep pace with Ukrainian needs, because the US has fallen far short. And so, all these countries are stepping up to the plate. And I know the Estonians and the Poles would love to have Ukraine as part of NATO. And it's only kind of the weaker wine drinking countries, Italy and France and I suppose Germany's beer drinking, but mentally they're kind of wine drinkers. All those countries that are having second doubts.
I mean, if you want to look at the glass half full, to Andy's point, we could end up with Ukraine, Finland, Sweden, and a much stronger NATO with countries exceeding the 2%, which would give us the ability to do more against the Chinese in the Indo-Pacific, right? Because now we have this stronger alliance, which is good for the United States. Everybody should remember, I probably heard it, but we've only used Article 5 once, and it was at our request to fight alongside of, and over 1,000 NATO forces died in Afghanistan for us. So it's in our interest, and we could get there. It's a bumpy road to get there, but we could get to a point where this has been a complete disaster for Russia. It already is, I think. But certainly we could put the nail in the coffin when it came to this being a disastrous strategic decision by Russia.
I read something in the study
for Russia's Putin's threatened escalation, and to Mick's comments about the Biden administration that terrified the Biden administration into drip feeding all these weapon systems. MLRS and ATACMS, I mean, you name it, which gave the Russians time to adapt and adjust. But yeah, if you if you or even threaten to bring Ukraine into the NATO fold, what is Russia going to do? Not, I mean, nothing. They're going to be powerless. All right. I mean, it's almost as though it's not that we're afraid of escalation. We're afraid of hurting their feelings.
Exactly.
I read this thing on the Institute of Study of War about Putin's worried about a peace deal because he's worried about Russian vets coming back home and starting, obviously being traumatized from the events and being upset about what went down, and like that being a bit of a, threat to his regime, his power, because you'll have a bunch of like military age guys who are really pissed about what went down and they're back home and they don't have jobs, and that could threaten his security, regime security anyway.
Yeah, it's probably a real concern because it's a real threat.
I mean, they're going to have to leave a significant army there, and they're already dealing with social problems from veterans coming back, and mainly because they emptied their prisons to feed the war in Ukraine, and now and they gave these guys like lifetime pardons and made them heroes. I mean, this is in the Western media too, and they come back and start murdering and stealing and raping, and no one can do anything about it. There's a significant social problem. I don't know, honestly, if it's feasible that Putin is worried about them joining together and staging a coup or anything. I mean, the Wagner group is one thing, but because they were already a coherent unit. But I'm not sure I buy the fear of all these yahoos coming back from the Ukrainian war and overthrowing Putin. But nevertheless, it's going to be a problem. It is a problem now. They've got significant problems. They've got, as I've said, I forget how many military-aged males overseas who now face prison sentences if they return, but that's a significant part of the labor force, and a lot of their most educated, and most and highly qualified middle class escaped. You just have to look around Tampa to see a massive Russian community there. So yeah, I mean, but the thing is, Putin's gonna have to, I mean, that's how he brings the country together, and that's how he shuts down opposition, by manufacturing crises. And so the war in Ukraine did that for him.
Certainly did.
Anything else on Ukraine and the ceasefire deal?
Sometimes I think, to Mick's point, both of us have talked about American values and America being, a world leader, and that's just kind of that's United States we grew up with, and in my case admired, and it's one of the reasons why I came to the US, but also because I broke my leg and I couldn't get in the British Army. But the point, I wonder sometimes whether the great unwashed, the American public really cares about all this stuff.
We certainly say it a lot. Leader of the free world, shiny city on the hill. I mean, that was President Reagan, right? That was the Republican Party. That was a Republican Party that I still think there's a substantial part of the Republican Party that believes that. You're seeing it from senators on the Hill. I mean, Senator Wicker was pretty clear.
Yeah.
He's a war criminal. He should be in prison for the rest of his life or executed. I mean, that doesn't leave, that is far from the other rhetoric that we're hearing. So I think that's also going to come through with traditional Republicans, to include Senator Lindsey Graham, who are very much cognizant of what Russia is and isn't. And they sure the hell aren't our friends. And we do have a moral obligations to our partner and allies. I mean, that's why people form alliances ultimately. And that's why people trust our word when we say we'll provide them security. I mean, they're asking for that now, right, with this ceasefire agreement, when they might point to the Budapest memorandum and say, well, is it even worth the paper it's written on? So there has to be some significant assurances that are guaranteed, I think, for the Ukrainians to feel comfortable with going ahead.
I mean, I agree with you 100%, Mick. And I think, yes, certainly. I mean, you would hope that GOP, that there are still, certainly in the Senate, those who believe in that, because, I mean, that was a very Reagan-esque view of the world too, right? I mean, it's coming from
Yes,
there.
absolutely.
Um, but I'm wondering about just the American public. I mean, I don't. We've all been national security professionals, with the exception of Dee. So maybe I should, question him. But Dee's tied into kind of our community too. He's like-minded. But I'm wondering whether the average American even cares about it anymore. And I mean, part of it is lack of education. Part of it is just the way that the media is right now. You get your news from an echo chamber, and a lot of it is just kind of it's that very kind of blinkered view of the world that it's what affects my pocketbook is everything, and I don't really care if what we do. I mean, think back to the fall of Afghanistan, right? That was a traumatic event for if I can speak for us collectively, anyone who'd served in Afghanistan, certainly for me, it was a hugely traumatic event because it wasn't just about losing a war. It was about the way it had happened. It was about betrayal of our allies. It was, all of this stuff. And yet the American public just didn't seem to care at all. Am I right?
I agree. Yeah, and for me, I'm kind of blunt like D on a lot of things, and whatever people think, as far as Russia is concerned, and I guess this is my blunt way of making the point that both of you made. There's that saying that people love to throw around, facts don't care about your feelings. You can feel however you want. The fact of the matter is that the Russian government, I'm not saying the Russian people, the Russian government and military views the United States as an enemy and will act accordingly. So it doesn't matter. You can say all you want all day long. I think I sent you guys something that someone had tweeted the other day or put on X saying that the U.S. and Russia would be great allies, make great allies or something like that. To me, that's just not going to happen. And as long as people keep those blinders on, Russia's going to keep doing what they're doing, knowing that they have at least that piece of the American population in their corner, and, Andy, you talked about blinders, and I agree. And I think those blinders on either side of it have media on one side, and the other blinder says what my political party tells me to think. And the Russians don't care about that. At the end of the day, they see us as our enemy, as their enemy. And I believe that we should view them as the same, plain and simple.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I've good friends who are civilians, believe it or not, and and it's dangerous to judge a whole country by my small circle of friends. But nevertheless, even among this group of friends, I hear apologies for Russia. Well, we really pushed them into this, right?
Yeah.
Encroachment of NATO. We go back to, the 90s and all of this. I'm like, wow, there was a reason why we did the things that we did in the 90s. Yes, some of it was probably a little ethically suspect, but it was with a view to our own national interests, and it was with a view to the fact that we knew that unless Russia was contained as it collapsed, and then that bad things would happen.
Yep.
And
And both sides of the political spectrum in the U.S. have gotten Russia wrong, right? Big red reset buttons, and that's your policy from the 80s, and now this version, right? So, and Russia the whole time, at least one thing you got to give them is they're consistent. They essentially want to do whatever they can to be in opposition to us wherever they can, right? They are very consistent, and Putin's, he would say, and he said many times, the biggest tragedy of our generation, of his generation, was the fall of the Soviet Union. He wants to try to get it. And Ukraine was the breadbasket. Ukraine had a great deal of their intellectual capability, they being the Soviet Union. He wanted Ukraine back. It wasn't because of encroachment. He knows that NATO isn't going to start a war with Russia. I mean, think about that economically, why they would ever even consider it, right? So he wanted to recreate the Soviet Union. Ukraine was there. He invaded it. We have to make it the biggest mistake of his life.
Yeah. Yeah, he looked like he was like kind of legacy shopping, I would say, getting up there in age and stuff like that. And he's like, what can I do before this, the lights turn off? Let's try and reestablish the USSR. I mean, it hasn't worked great. I mean, it's not great that he does have the American president on side now. Gonna be completely real with you guys. Another
Maybe
thing,
this turns around. Let's all
Well, I mean,
let's do our own interest.
sadly, the USSR that he wants to revert to is kind of the Stalinist USSR. It's not the latter-day USSR, because I'm not an apologist for Soviet Russia, but the fact is that at least in the last decade or so, I mean, there were positive things about Soviet society that the collapse starkly emphasized the fact that that everyone did have a job, right? I mean, the jobs weren't great, they weren't paid well, but everyone had a job, everyone had security. Their lives were unbearably monotonous. There were 100 things wrong with it, but at the same time, they had that basis of security. And there were, I get it. I've read the Gulag Archipelago. I understand everything that went on under Stalin and Khrushchev. But in the latter years, you, as a dissident, you weren't likely to suffer the same fate as you are now as a dissident in Putin's Russia, which is consignment to another archipelago and likely death.
all right. Yeah, a lot going to be said about this. Obviously, stay tuned to Eyes On, because we're the best geopolitical podcast maybe ever.
When are we getting our own T-shirts?
They're coming soon. We do have our own T-shirts. You can grab them at the link in the description.
Looking for one that fits me across the chest, but
Yeah.
We haven't made that one yet.
We're getting yours specially made, custom made. It's like a $4,000 T-shirt.
make sure you just a little more room in the biceps.
Yeah, that's what I told him first and foremost. Like he's too swole. Those biceps won't fit in anything we try and give him. Other bit of news, a little bit of like a semi-purge at the DOD. CQ Brown, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, was fired yesterday. A lot of rhetoric going on about that one. He was visiting the southern border while it happened probably 2 or 3 hours later. So I don't know if he was really expecting it. I think another group of people also got fired when he got fired as well. Mick, what are you thinking on this?
Yeah, and apparently more today. I mean, I'll start with, obviously the president gets to choose his own people. And I do think if the incoming team wants to look at, diversity, equity, inclusion policy, whether, and if we do, I don't know, but it's certainly out there about quotas on folks, then that's one discussion. But I'd like to start with pointing out that this idea of calling out, full disclosure, I know CQ Brown, General Brown, he was the deputy commander at Central Command when I was at the Pentagon. Yeah. Great individual. But I like to really point out that he was a perfect example of meritocracy. So to refer to him as a DEI hire is not only counterfactual, it's insulting, and it's quite frankly disgraceful to a person who spends so much time in service to his country. I mean, fighter pilot, squadron commander, wing commander, deputy at CENTCOM. He was in charge of all Air Force activity in the Pacific. He was chief of staff of the Air Force chosen by the first Trump administration, which to me indicates, and it should to anybody, that they believed he could be the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. You don't put somebody in charge of the Air Force, and I think the Space Force, right? Also, if you don't think he's qualified to be the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And so then to turn around and fire him abruptly and say, DIR, it's not right. It's not right. And I'll start with that. I don't know the Admiral, and I think somebody can make the same case for her. If you disagree with the policy, two things. If you disagree, have the discussion. I've heard it on both sides. I could certainly see that it, in many cases, gone too far. The other part of that is there's civilian leadership at the Pentagon. right? So even the most senior military person, the chairman, is an advisor. They don't set policy. So you've then basically punished them, if you will, for the policy of your previous administration, right? So they carry out policy. They advise and then they carry out policy. So we don't even know where, in this case, CQ stood on this stuff. But it is clear that he was a great American and he deserved much better than this, peanut gallery, basically questioning his qualifications to serve in a place where this exact administration appointed him in the last administration, essentially. So I'll get off my soapbox, but
you
haven't
made
seen
the
people
you made the
really
key point, which is, we military leaders enforce policy given to them by the civilian leadership. And so to punish a military commander for enforcing what he's been told by, the Secretary of Defense or the president is quite frankly absurd. Number one, and number two, I echo, a couple of thoughts about about CQ is that, I didn't get to call him that, but I did brief him regularly when I was at SOCCENT. And I'll say this, he was highly respected within the Air Force, very highly respected. I never heard anyone say anything negative about him, to include among his peers. That's number one. Number two, he was a great guy to brief because unlike several other generals over there at CENTCOM or anywhere, he wasn't dismissive of briefers. He knew their names. He would ask them really good questions. Just the way he treated subordinates, I thought was exceptional, and it was indicative of his character. And he'll be okay. And I'm sure there's part of him that's may also be almost be relieved, because there was all this chatter about him going to be fired from even before the administration came in. And so, a guy like that who is very highly talented will rise to the top wherever he is. And we just, this country is fortunate that he was chairman for that period that he was.
Here.
Yeah, and I'm just you gents have had interactions with him personally and professionally. I have not, but for me, point blank, as soon as someone throws out the term DEI hire as an insult, I just turn them off mentally anyway. So none of that means any shit to me. Like if you even if you can show me in someone's record, which I've never understood, when someone calls someone a DEI hire, is that in their service record somewhere? Is that in their professional record where it's stamped DEI hire? If you can't show me that, sorry to borrow a term from you, D, but fuck off. That means nothing to me. So as soon as I hear that, I just dismiss that argument outright.
I mean, a guy like that cannot go to the level of chief of staff of the Air Force and then chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff by just because he's a black guy. Like, what the fuck are we talking about? You know what I mean?
That's how I got on this panel, but
yeah,
whatever works, right?
I mean, at some point though, people need to be fucking serious at some point and understand things logically and rationally, right? Like if we're talking about America, please,
it's a dangerous precedent. It's a dangerous precedent, regardless of which political party does it, to fire a senior member of the military for reasons other than competence,
right?
Behavior, to fire him simply because you disagree with policies that he has enforced on the behest of his civilian leadership. It's a dreadful policy, and what it does, and then to bring in someone because I'm not saying necessarily this is what's happening, but bringing someone in because politically they're more aligned with you, undermines the fact that the military, one of its strengths in this country is that it is supposed to be apolitical. I mean, Marshall, right? General Marshall took it to the point where he didn't even vote. Which is, it's excessive. Of course, military members have the right to vote. They have the right to have political views. Of course they do. But they've also taught that you don't combine the two. You don't combine your duties with your political views ever. And there's no quicker way to be kicked out of the military than, than to do that. It's why we can't, speak out politically in uniform. Indeed, when we're on active duty, there's pretty tight constraints on what we can say about, either our support or opposition to any political party.
Mick, you sound like you were.
And for those who don't understand that, who don't understand why, think about it. Do you want Department of Defense that represents, I mean, it's the largest department, obviously, military, the 2 million trained killers with all the weapons and everything they have. Do you want them to side with a particular party, or their leadership to side with a political party? And we've just finished talking about what's been happening in South Korea, right? And it's not too far-fetched.
Yeah, that's what George Washington warned about, right?
Yeah.
Our first president and our first general. No, it's clear that not only the military, but the IC and the law enforcement community, federal specifically, needs to stay out of politics entirely. And it's an issue that I think people should be concerned about if that's the way we're going, that people are being chosen not for their merit, right? This is supposed to be about meritocracy. And you can look at the backgrounds of every chairman that we've ever had, and you can match them up. And guess who's gonna stand right there with the credentials that most have? CQ Brown. Guess who's not? And I don't know him, but the individual that they've picked, right? He hasn't commanded a service. He hasn't commanded a command. He hasn't been a 4-star, and he was retired. So if this is about meritocracy, and obviously, very few people are actually qualified to be the chairman. But CQ Brown had the qualifications to be the chairman. And I think we can all say that the individual that was appointed, who of course has to get through confirmation, does not have historically the same qualifications. And according to President Trump, one of the reasons he chose him is he told him he loved him and that he would kill for him. So, I mean, if that's true, and what do I know? But I doubt it is. I can't see any military officer saying that. If it's true, he's disqualified. If it's not true, that's going to be the first question he gets at his confirmation. Did you say that? Right? You don't kill for a person. Yeah. You don't kill, right? You defend you follow lawful orders and you defend your country.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be a test of the Senate. A lot of this is, I mean, particularly the GOP senators on what do they love most, their country or a particular individual. I mean,
guys, we've seen what the Senate's been doing for the last few confirmations, right? Like Kash Patel was just confirmed on Thursday. Like, he's qualified. Hegseth's qualified. Come on, what are we talking about? I'll take the job, head of the FBI. What are we talking? It's a joke. Like, we could be honest, or at least I'll be honest. I don't know.
Well, the checks and balances are not working as anticipated, right? I mean, you've got the courts, but the courts' ability to really provide a check are dependent on the process, which is inherent with delays, right? And so that's why you have the legislature that is supposed to provide a check, and particularly the Senate. But it remains to be seen whether the Senate will do that.
God,
we always on that, and on also the Russian ceasefire negotiations. I think we're seeing a lot of senators that are willing to step out and push back.
I hope more join them, left or right, doesn't matter. Like,
it takes courage. It takes courage, but on the other hand, that's why you're in that position.
Yeah, and ultimately, I mean, I think we'd all be better off if the party of Reagan resurfaced. So you can see where I am in this. And not that anybody's asking me, but if you don't get reelected, who gives a damn?
Yeah.
Go down with integrity and then go get a job.
Yeah.
I mean, it's okay for all these federal workers that are getting fired right now for no apparent reason. So, go down with your integrity. And if you get unelected because you've stuck up to what you believed, you should be proud of it. and just move on.
Yeah.
I wish people were that. I wish people did that, to be honest.
Yeah.
God, we always end on a great note. I want to thank you guys. Go ahead.
Personal ambition, excessive personal ambition can be extremely insidious. We see that in our military careers. Fortunately, quite rarely, I have to say. But everyone knows that officer who will do anything to get promoted, right? And I'm sure those people, it's common knowledge that there are congressmen like that who would do anything to get reelected, but you kind of think that the Senate is as kind of the senior chamber, the more mature chamber. You're going to find a great deeper wells of moral courage.
I mean,
going all the way back to Roman Senate, right? Which I think somebody actually told me is a Latin word for old men, right? Nobody remembers the ones that just gave harumps. Nobody remembers the ones that just agreed. It's not even a thing. Ultimately, you're forgotten in history if you're just the person who just nods to get elected. Nobody cares except for maybe you. So, I mean, this is going to be an issue that are we going to have three branches of government? Are we going to have a balance of powers? This is all the basic part of our system that I think a lot of Americans, left, right, and center, are looking at making sure it continues that way.
Right on. All right, guys. Any and all links for the guys: Mick Mulroy, Fogbow, Longbow, doing great work. The link is in the description. Andy Milburn, follow him on X, Blusky, wherever else. His book, When the Tempest Gathers, incredible memoir. Jason Lyons, all his links are in the description as well. If you want an Eyes On t-shirt or an Eyes On mug, that link is in the description as well. Feel free to go and buy that and support the show. Also, you can support the show at patreon.com/theteamhouse. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, guys.
Byron.
Thanks.